The deputy leader of Libya's ruling National Transitional Council says he's stepping down after a series of protests against the country's new leaders. Saturday, crowds stormed the council's headquarters in the city of Benghazi, angry at the slow rate of democratic change and demanding the government's resignation. Protesters threw stones and metal bars at the building in the first acts of violence against Libya's interim leaders. Demonstrators have been rallying for weeks in Benghazi, the center of last year's revolution against the Gaddafi regime. They accuse the leadership of lacking transparency and want to know how Libya's assets are being spent. We're now joined live by Salbuchi, expert on North African affairs and international consultant. Thanks for joining us here on RT and lending us your insight. So, Libya's interim leaders were not elected, so to what level do you think they're pursuing the people's interests?
Well, I think that first of all we have to understand that when countries are overrun, invaded, and their populations bombed, violence is always what follows after that. We've seen it throughout history in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. We've seen it during World War II when France was invaded by Germany. We've seen it during the Cold War, so it should be no different in Libya. Libya is not under a civil war. Libya has been invaded officially by the UN and NATO, basically NATO as a military force, but they are both acting as instruments for the United States, Britain, France, and the European Union as a whole, especially Italy, because of the historical ties. So in a way, what we are seeing is how the wealth, the interests of these of the Western powers in Libya have used this invasion, have used internal strife, and promoted it so that all this infighting will go on. All countries have horrible, important internal strife, even Britain, even the United States, and even the European Union. And what we have seen, I believe, is how terror organizations like the CIA, MI6,
but
and
given
the Israeli
how NATO stepped in and the UN stepped in an airstrike role, what do you think is the foreign footprint in Libya right now, actually?
Well, that is the point I wanted to make. Shall we call them the dirty tricks departments at the CIA, MI6, and the Mossad have taken advantage of all these internal strife, and they've literally split the country into two, calling those in Benghazi with the National Transitional Council as freedom fighters, but we're seeing that they're not really freedom fighters. We're seeing the same process, and we've seen the same process in Egypt. We're seeing that also now in Syria. The end game naturally goes into Iran directly, so what we are seeing is how the foreign Western powers are taking advantage and promoting these so-called Arab Springs, but in fact, in the end, it's geopolitics, it's oil, and it's also trying to take advantage of the other wealth in that region, especially for the geopolitical interests of the State of Israel. The United States calls the shots in the world, but in a way, Israel calls the shots in the United States.
The National Transitional Council has the support of Western powers who helped force out Gaddafi, but they say they don't have enough money to improve life in the country. Why do you think that is?
Well, because their mission in Libya, for example, is not to improve life in the country. Libya already had the highest standard of living under Gaddafi in all of North Africa. What Libya does have is the 9th largest global oil reserve and the top oil reserve in Africa, and that is what the National Transitional Council are being supported for, in order that they should promote Western oil companies, Western financial interests in Libya, and the people will just have to bear it out. The people have already been bombed, killed. A veritable genocide has taken place, as we've seen in Iraq. So in a way, the same pattern is repeated over and over again, where there's a double standard. They say that they are promoting democracy, but what they are basically doing is promoting the financial and geopolitical interests of the global power elite embedded inside the United States, Britain, the European Union, and Israel.
All right. Both Egypt and Libya, the revolutions that toppled the previous regime, seem to have failed to achieve democratic process that people set out to. Those people who are out in the streets frustrated by the lack of reforms, do you think they're frustrated as to why democracy hasn't emerged?
Well, absolutely. And besides, we are not defining democracy. I remember that on 10th March of last year, Hillary Clinton visited Tunisia and Egypt because she wanted to, quote, ensure that Egypt has the kind of democracy that we want to see. And the kind of democracy that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and the Bushes want to see is definitely not the kind of democracy that Egypt and all the countries in North Africa and the Middle East really need, because it's not democracy at all. It is merely puppet governments subordinated to money power, and a, quote, democracy subordinated to money power.
So you think the Islamists who came to power recently in Egypt are going to follow Washington's line?
We are seeing the infighting because there are factions that want to follow the Washington line, and there are obviously factions that don't. So naturally, what the Western powers do time and again in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Egypt, is just generate internal strife in the hope that as that internal strife settles down, they will be able to take their advantage. They have no interest for the people of Egypt or of any of those countries whatsoever.
Now, the people in Libya say they want the current authorities to go. Many of them want them to step down. Given the tribal divisions in the country, how do you see its political future? Do you think it will become a solid, peaceful state run by a government?
No, there is no way that it can become a sovereign state because it has been invaded, and there is no sign that that invasion will let up. As a matter of fact, Iranian television are informing that there are 12,000 troops in Libya. Probably not true, but there are reports that there are 12,000 American troops in Malta ready to take over, for example, the town of Brega, where all the oil refineries are. So this whole thing smells of oil and not of the national interests of the Libyan people.
All right, Adrian Salbuchi, North Africa expert and international consultant, thanks for your insight.